They say betrayal doesn't always arrive with a crash. Sometimes it comes with the soft clatter of a spoon in a teacup, or the quiet hush of a husband's suitcase being zipped in the dim light of 2 a.m. My name is Cassandra Lewis. I am 36 years old, and for 12 years I have been the quiet, steady wife, the one who hosted Sunday dinners, who folded every towel just so, who smiled through clenched teeth at family birthdays that never celebrated me. I believed in loyalty, in sacrifice, in home, and that was exactly what they took from me. It started with kindness. Doesn't it always? My parents need somewhere to stay for a few months, David had said one March evening, his voice hopeful, yet carrying that undertone I'd learned to heed, the one that meant his mind was made up. They're in a tight spot. I'd nodded. I knew what tight spots felt like. So I opened our doors, not just to his parents, but to the chaos they brought with them, the rearranged furniture, the whispered judgments, the constant overshadowing of my presence in my own house. What was meant to be a few months became 12. 12 months of my kitchen no longer smelling like cinnamon and nutmeg on Sunday mornings, but of scorched bacon and entitlement. 12 months of finding my favorite reading chair gone, stored in the garage to make space for his mother's antique sideboard. 12 months of watching David shrink from the man I married into the boy who needed his mother's approval more than his wife's respect. Still, I stayed. I adapted. I even gave up the upstairs office so his brother, Paul, could work remotely in peace. He was unemployed, but the peace part, I suppose, was accurate. Then one day, something shifted. Not outside, but in me. It was quiet, like the click of a lock. I asked, after a long day of cleaning a house that no longer felt like mine, when do your parents plan on moving out? David didn't even look up from his phone. They're staying, he said, casually. If you don't like it, maybe you should leave. I stood there, the vacuum still humming against the hardwood. Maybe I should? I repeated. And that's when Paul came downstairs, arms crossed like he'd been waiting for this moment since the first box was unpacked. Finally, he muttered. It was the way he said it. With relief. As if he'd been squatting in my silence, waiting for me to fold. But I didn't fold. I packed. It was dark when I wheeled the suitcase to the closet, our closet, or what used to be. His suits were still there, still perfectly lined in shades of charcoal and navy. My side was sparse. I'd been shrinking for years. But tucked in the far corner, behind the coats no one wore anymore, was the old built-in safe. They didn't know I had it reinstalled last spring when the contractors were renovating the closet. They didn't know it had been there all along. My hands trembled slightly as I entered the code. Inside, exactly where I'd left them, the documents. Deeds, copies of the prenup, savings bonds, and the letter. Oh, that letter. David had never asked why I insisted on keeping the house in my name. I trust you, he'd said, and I had smiled. Because trust, I've learned, is not something you say. It's something you prove, or fail to. I removed the envelope, the one with the attorney's seal, and the flash drive marked for when they think you're weak. My fingers brushed the worn corners of the letter inside. It was from my grandmother, who had left me the house under one condition: never let anyone make you feel like a guest in your own home. As I closed the safe, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding escaped my lungs. I wasn't just leaving that night. I was reclaiming something far greater than four walls. By the time I stepped into the moonlit driveway, suitcase in hand, the air smelled like a freedom I hadn't breathed in years. It was sharp, cold, honest. I didn't say goodbye. There was no ceremony to it, no shouting, no weeping, no scenes drawn like theater. Only the faint thud of the front door closing behind me. That sound was a full stop at the end of a sentence I'd been trying not to write for a decade. As I drove through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, every familiar tree and street lamp blurred with memory. I remembered the way David had first carried me over the threshold, laughing. The way we'd painted the walls together, arguing over eggshell versus ivory like it meant something. Back then, it did. It meant hope. But hope is fragile. And I had been the only one holding it up. I checked into a modest inn on the edge of town, one I'd passed 1,000 times, but never entered. The clerk didn't ask why my eyes were red or why my hands shook slightly as I handed over my ID. He just gave me the key and pointed down a quiet hallway. Room 208. I sat on the bed, the suitcase unopened, and let the silence wrap around me. No in-laws clattering in the kitchen. No David with his passive sighs and silence. Just the hum of the radiator and the weight of everything unsaid. It wasn't until the second night that I opened the suitcase, not just to unpack, but to take inventory. Not of clothes, but of truths. There were 3 journals in there, records I'd kept over the years. Not diaries, no. These were detailed logs of every rent payment I covered while his parents got back on their feet, of every time they undermined me, every gaslight flickered in small, daily gestures. Receipts, emails, conversations half heard and always meant to wound. I'd started writing it all down not out of spite, but to remind myself I wasn't crazy. That the slow erosion of my worth wasn't a figment of my imagination, but a campaign. I reread an entry from 6 months ago. His mother moved my wedding photo off the mantel today. Said it clashed with her decor. David said nothing. Later, I found it in the laundry room behind the detergent. I remember crying quietly that night. Not for the photo, but because I realized I could disappear from the house entirely and no one would notice. Or worse, they'd be relieved. But I was done being invisible. The flash drive I'd taken from the safe contained not just financial documents, but video recordings. I'd installed a discreet security system a year ago after one too many misplaced items and accidental entries into my office. I hadn't told David. Not because I was hiding something, but because I suspected they were. I connected the flash drive to my laptop and began reviewing the footage. And there it was. Paul in my office rifling through drawers. His mother on the phone telling someone, it's just a matter of time. Once we get her out, David will finally have full access. David, sitting silently as his parents discussed listing my house on their retirement plan. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just toxic behavior. This was premeditated. A soft knock on the door jolted me. Room service. I hadn't ordered anything. A note lay on the tray beneath a slice of strawberry shortcake. It read, I thought you might need something sweet tonight. You were always too good for them. A friend. My heart twisted. Amanda. She worked with me at the gallery and had always been sharper than people gave her credit for. I remembered the look she gave me the last time David stopped by my workplace. You okay? She'd asked quietly as he walked off with his phone pressed to his ear. I'd nodded. Lied. I texted her. Thank you. I needed this more than you know. The reply came instantly. I've got more where that came from. Just say when. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because of clarity. This was no longer about salvaging a marriage. This was about reclaiming my narrative. They thought I would slink away, a broken woman with nothing. But I had everything I needed. The next step wouldn't be emotional. It would be surgical. And the first incision would be legal, be why the 4th morning in that modest inn I had slipped into a rhythm. Wake early. Brew weak coffee in the little machine that sputtered like an old man clearing his throat. Review documents. Take notes. Rebuild myself from the paper trail of all the things they thought I wouldn't remember. It was strange how clear things become when no one is talking over you. I called my attorney, Jenna Rayner. We'd only met once, years ago, when I was updating my will after the car accident. She was brilliant and kind, the sort of woman who wore Navy power suits, but never made you feel small across the table. I need to invoke the homeowner clause in our prenup, I said, voice steady. A pause. Then, Olivia, is everything all right? No, I answered. But it will be. She didn't ask questions. Just told me to email the documents and meet her the next day. I stared at the ceiling that night, my mind flickering between memories like a broken projector. I remembered how David had laughed when I insisted the house remain in my name. Sure, he'd said, kissing my temple. You've always been the careful one. Careful. Like not putting my name on the home would have been reckless. Like knowing love couldn't replace leverage made me cold. What he didn't realize is that I wasn't just protecting property, I was protecting the only piece of myself I had left when I married him. The next morning, I walked into Jenna's office with a folder in hand and certainty in my step. She skimmed the pages quickly. "This is damning." "Yes." "And the security footage?" she asked. I slid the flash drive across the desk. She plugged it into her computer, watching without expression as Paul muttered about getting rid of her, and David nodded absently, sipping coffee in my favorite mug, the one I'd painted at a pottery workshop years ago with "Home is where peace lives" scribbled on the side. She stopped the footage mid-frame. "This isn't just evidence of bad behavior," she said. "This is a coordinated effort to establish residency and claim rights to your home." "I know. I can file an emergency motion by end of day." I nodded. "And Olivia," she leaned in, "this was not your failure. This is your awakening." Her words stayed with me as I left her office, slipping back into the world that once looked familiar but now felt like a stage built for someone else's comfort. I was done playing the supporting role in a life I designed. By the time I returned to the inn, my phone buzzed with a message from Jenna. Filed. Judge will review by Friday. They'll be served over the weekend. I stared at the message. My hands trembled not with fear, but with a quiet, ferocious relief. Later that night, I wrote in my journal. I thought leaving was the end of something, but it was the beginning of a reckoning. Not just for them, but for me. The next morning, I did something unexpected. I visited my old house. Not to fight, not to confront, but to walk past it one more time, to see it through new eyes. It looked smaller, the curtains different, the front garden, once my pride, overgrown with weeds. Paul was on the porch smoking a cigar. He didn't see me. I slipped past like a shadow. I didn't need him to see me. The universe would handle that part soon enough. They say you hear a knock before the storm. For them, it came at 8:17 a.m. on a Sunday. I wasn't there to witness it, but I imagined it clearly. The sharp rap at the door. Paul stumbling toward it in his bathrobe, his hair wild and his ego even more so. David groggily descending the stairs, coffee in hand. And then 2 envelopes. One for David. One for the house. One for the performance of arrogance finally being served its reckoning. I watched from my car down the street, engine idling, hands steady on the wheel. The process server walked back down the steps without fanfare. Just a job. Just another file. But to me, it was liberation stitched into legal language. Jenna had been meticulous. The emergency motion detailed not only the terms of the prenuptial agreement, which gave me sole ownership of the property, but also the security footage, financial documentation, and, crucially, the breach of agreed boundaries that transformed guests into hostile occupiers. I drove away as the door closed behind the bewildered men who had once smirked at my silence. They had no idea the silence was a strategy. That week, David called. 7 times. Left 3 voicemails. "Olivia, can we talk?" "Liv, you didn't have to do this. Please." I never answered. Not because I lacked words, but because I finally realized I didn't owe him any more of mine. Instead, I wrote myself a letter. A letter of return, not to him, not to the house, but to me. Dear Cassandra, you were never the guest in your own life. You were the architect. And now, you're the fire that clears the land. Burn it clean. Rebuild in peace. Love. Your future self. That night, Amanda texted me. "Want to grab dinner? Or throw darts at pictures of smug in-laws?" "I'm flexible." I smiled. We met at a small pub near the waterfront. I wore a soft gray dress I hadn't touched in years, the one David once said looked too serious for a date night. Amanda whistled when she saw me. "Damn," she said. "You look like you just fired an army and bought the castle." I laughed for the first time in weeks. The kind of laugh that shakes dust off the bones. Over wine and fried pickles, I told her everything. And when I paused, afraid I'd overshared, she reached across the table and said, "You didn't escape a home, Cass. You escaped a trap disguised as tradition." When I returned to the inn that night, the sky was the color of healing deep violet, soft around the edges. I looked up and whispered, "Thank you." To no one. To everyone. To the girl I used to be. The next day, the judge ruled in my favor. David, Paul, and their parents had 14 days to vacate. No appeal. The message was clear. Cassandra Lewis was not a woman you could push out of her own story. It rained the day they left. Not a violent, angry storm, but a quiet, persistent drizzle, like the sky weeping for things that couldn't be salvaged. I stood across the street under a black umbrella, coat buttoned to my chin, watching the slow parade of cardboard boxes and disgruntled faces file out of what was once my home. David didn't look up. Paul slammed the trunk of the car with the kind of anger that comes not from injustice, but from the end of entitlement. His mother, a walking critique in pearls and condescension, made a show of wiping down surfaces on the way out. As if dignity could be found in cleaning a house you were no longer welcome in. They moved slowly, begrudgingly, like squatters being dragged out by fate rather than force. My attorney had arranged for a neutral third party to oversee the vacating, someone neither of us could accuse of manipulation. And so, under the supervision of a quietly amused real estate mediator named James, they left one by one. By 5:12 p.m., the house was mine again. I waited until they were gone. Not because I feared confrontation, but because I wanted to enter in silence. To hear the house speak to me again, unfiltered. When I stepped through the door, the air was musty. The scent of stale food and heavy perfume lingered in the foyer. But beneath it, I smelled something else. Stillness. I walked through every room like a widow inspecting the ruins of a war she didn't start, but finished. My office had been stripped of all but the desk. They had taken the chair, the books, even the curtains. But not the journals, not the safe, not the records of all they'd tried to erase. The kitchen, once my sanctuary, had been left in disarray. Open cabinets, crumbs, an empty bottle of Chardonnay on the counter. Upstairs, the master bedroom had been ransacked in their haste. The bed was stripped, the closet bare, but one of my sweaters still hung behind the door. The navy one, soft from years of wear. I pressed it to my chest and wept. Not for them. Not even for the marriage. But for the years I spent believing love meant sacrificing myself. I slept in the guest room that night. Not because I couldn't sleep in my bed, but because I needed to reclaim that space slowly, carefully, with reverence. The way you approach something sacred after years of letting others defile it. The next morning, I opened the windows. Let fresh air flood the rooms. I played music loud and defiant. Nina Simone, Stevie Nicks, women who knew about rising. Amanda arrived later with paint swatches and pastries. "First order of business," she said, "we sage the hell out of this place. Second, we paint that bedroom the color of rebirth." I chose a pale green, like new leaves after winter. As we painted, she told me stories about her own quiet battles. The things we never talked about at work, but always carried like stones in our pockets. And I realized something. We weren't alone. None of us. There were legions of women like me, like Amanda, reclaiming their homes, their names, their narratives. They weren't always loud, but they were unstoppable. With every stroke of paint, I felt like I was erasing shadows, covering over the fingerprints of those who had tried to write their story over mine. The pale green turned the bedroom into something gentle and alive, like spring thawing beneath my skin. Amanda joked that we were giving the house a soul bath, and I laughed, splattering color on the floor, not caring for once about the mess. The walls, I believe, remember everything. And now they would remember this. Two women, humming softly to Fleetwood Mac, painting over grief with defiance. By the third day of reclamation, I discovered more than I expected. Tucked in the back of a kitchen drawer was a folded note. At first, I assumed it was just another grocery list or receipt. But when I opened it, the handwriting was unmistakable. David's. See, if you find this, I'm sorry. Not for what happened, because I know I went too far, but for the part of me that watched it happen and said nothing. They made the house feel full, but you made it feel like home. I hope you remember who you are without me. D. I sat with the note for a long while. Not crying. Not angry. Just quiet. That note wasn't an apology. It was a breadcrumb, one small kernel of regret left behind in the ruins. But I didn't need it. I knew who I was without him. I was the woman who signed every mortgage payment, who built the kitchen from scratch after the fire, who kept the house warm when everyone else was cold. He may have forgotten, but the house hadn't. Later that week, I met with Jenna again to go over the final court filings. It was just paperwork now. The marriage officially dissolved, assets returned to rightful hands. But when she handed me the folder and smiled, I felt a final page turn in my chest. You're free, she said simply. I know, I replied. But I think I was free the moment I packed that suitcase. Outside her office, I watched couples walk by on the sidewalk. Some laughing, some arguing, some just quiet together. I didn't envy them, not because I feared love, but because I finally understood what it should not cost. That night, I cooked myself a meal. Just for me. Salmon with lemon and dill, roasted sweet potatoes, and a glass of red wine. I set the table with a linen napkin and lit a candle. No one to impress. No one to perform for. And, still, I smiled. Because I was finally the guest of honor in my own life. Freedom is not loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare or trumpets. It creeps in through the cracks, like morning light through an old window pane. I noticed it in small things first, waking up to silence that didn't feel empty, choosing a cup from the cabinet without wondering if it would start a passive-aggressive war, walking barefoot across the living room with no one commenting on the wear and tear. It was peace, but it took time for me to trust it. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and ash, I walked into the backyard for the first time since they left. The garden was overgrown, a tangle of forgotten roses and dying basil, but I could still see the outline of the stone path I'd laid by hand years ago. Each stone had a memory. That corner by the lilac bush? That's where David first told me he loved me. The patch of grass near the fence? That's where we'd planned to build a koi pond, a dream that wilted like the hydrangeas he stopped watering. But I didn't cry. I crouched, pulled on gloves, and began to weed. By the time the moon rose, my hands were covered in dirt, and the herb bed was visible again. Tangled roots fought me, but I knew something about persistence. I had spent years tending a relationship that bore no fruit. This was different. This was a garden I could replant. Amanda stopped by the next day with wildflower seeds. I know they're not roses, she said, shrugging. But they grow like hell in neglected soil. I laughed. Perfect. We scattered the seeds by hand, her laughter trailing into the wind like hope reborn. I felt like we were writing something into the land, something the house itself would remember. That weekend, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name, scrawled in thin, hesitant handwriting. Inside was a single page. Olivia. I didn't know how to reach you. David's been staying with me. He's not well. Keeps saying he thought he was doing the right thing. I know you probably don't care anymore, and maybe you shouldn't. But I wanted you to know. Karen. His aunt. The only one who ever spoke to me like a human being. I folded the letter carefully. David wasn't well. There was a time when that would have unraveled me. When I would have driven across town with soup and a suitcase of solutions. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I whispered into the kitchen air, may he find healing. But not at my expense. I tucked the letter into a drawer, not out of guilt, but as a reminder. That loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing yourself at the altar of their dysfunction. 2 weeks after they'd left, the house felt lighter. Not just in furniture, but in spirit. I moved through it barefoot, reclaiming corners with books and candles, things that once made the space mine before I let them be pushed aside for family convenience. I stood in the hallway one morning and realized something profound. There were no echoes anymore. No phantom footsteps. No muttered judgments behind closed doors. Just the creak of old wood and the slow exhale of walls that had waited too long for quiet. And yet, one ghost lingered. David. I don't mean he haunted the house, he haunted my memory. Not the man he became, but the one he pretended to be in the beginning. The man who made French toast on Sundays, who tucked notes in my coat pocket that read, "Your smile is my favorite home." How strange that someone could build you up and still stand idle while others tore you down. Amanda noticed it too. One afternoon, as we rearranged the guest room, now my art studio, she paused mid-step. You don't talk about him much. I shrugged, placing a canvas against the wall. There's not much left to say. Maybe. Or maybe you're saving it for when it won't hurt as much. She was right. And I hated that she was. That night, I sat on the floor with an old photo album. Not to punish myself, but to understand. I flipped through years of vacations, anniversary dinners, family gatherings, snapshots of a life curated for others. I saw it clearly now. The way I always leaned toward him, trying to bridge a gap he stopped noticing. The way my eyes looked alert, not joyful. Performing, not present. I closed the album and whispered, I forgive you, Olivia. Because I needed it. Because healing wasn't just about them. It was about me no longer carrying the weight of who I had to become in their presence. The next morning, I visited the gallery. It had been weeks since I'd stepped foot inside, choosing instead to work remotely while I rebuilt. But now, I walked through the glass doors with something new in my chest, clarity. Cass, Amanda greeted me. We sold the last of your Blue Silence series. I blinked. Really? They said it felt like standing in a storm that finally passed. I smiled. Not just because the work sold, but because someone had felt what I painted. After years of not being seen, that mattered. More than marriage. More than validation. Art didn't lie. And neither did the woman I was becoming. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of life slowly rebuilt itself. Not the old rhythm I once followed like a metronome set by someone else's hand, but something rawer, more honest. I started waking with the sun again, not out of obligation, but because it greeted me through the window like an old friend. The mornings were quiet, but no longer lonely. They were mine. And yet, in the early hour between tea and emails, a new habit formed, writing letters I would never send. They weren't for David. Not really. They were for the versions of myself I had left behind. To the Cassandra who stayed up all night preparing Thanksgiving dinner while his mother criticized your cranberry sauce. You didn't do anything wrong. Their palates were bland, not your flavors. To the Cassandra who bought blackout curtains for Paul's room because he was sensitive to light, but never once got a thank you. You were never their servant. You were their host. And hosts have the right to reclaim their peace. I wrote dozens of them. Folded them neatly. Burned them in a ceramic bowl on the back porch, letting the smoke rise like a chorus of soft goodbyes. That ritual, letter and fire, became a kind of cleansing. Not for them. For me. One afternoon, while sorting through an old storage bin in the attic, I came across a small cardboard box labeled Cass before. Inside were photographs, a few sketches from my college portfolio, and a letter I had written to myself at 25, sealed in a white envelope. I had forgotten all about it. I opened it with trembling hands. Dear Cass, if you're reading this, I hope you've built a life where you're no longer apologizing for wanting space, art, quiet mornings, and peace. I hope you still love rain and lavender and the sound of your own breath. I hope you didn't let anyone convince you that being soft means being weak. I hope you're still you. Love. 25-year-old you, who's terrified but hopeful asterisk. I sat in the attic, knees pulled to my chest, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. Hopeful. She had been so hopeful. And now, so was I. Not because everything had healed overnight, but because the healing was finally mine to do. That night, I began a new painting. This one not for a series, not for sale. Just for me. It was a portrait of a house. Not the one they occupied, but the one that finally, after all the silence, held me again. By the time October settled into the marrow of the town, cool winds, rust-colored leaves, and evenings tinged with wood smoke, I had settled too. Not into a routine dictated by survival, but into one shaped by softness, by intent. I redecorated slowly, like someone learning to speak a new language. Every item brought back into the house had to earn its place, not just for usefulness, but for peace. No more furniture that reminded me of tense dinners, no more wall art chosen to please guests who never cared what brought me joy. I framed one of my own pieces. A tree, bare but standing, roots tangled in gold thread. Amanda saw it during a visit and tilted her head. It looks like something weathered 1,000 storms. It has, I said. And it's still growing. She smiled. Like you. But healing isn't a straight line. Some days I felt light enough to float. Others, the silence was so loud it pressed against my ribs. Grief lingered in strange places, an old sweater, the drawer where David once kept his cufflinks, the way I still reached for 2 mugs some mornings. I didn't miss him. I missed the idea of who he might have been. And that was grief of a different kind. One night, I found myself standing at the edge of the bed, staring at the pillow he used to sleep on. I considered sleeping on that side, reclaiming the space. But I wasn't ready. So I sat down and whispered into the quiet. You don't get to take this with you. I moved the pillow to the guest room. The next morning, I ordered new bedding. Crisp linen, seafoam green. No more compromise for aesthetics that weren't mine. That weekend, I hosted friends for dinner, Amanda, our friend Joe, and their partners. Nothing elaborate, just wine, laughter, mismatched plates, and a house that no longer recoiled at the sound of company. At one point, Joe looked around and said, "It feels like the house can breathe again." I nodded, holding my wineglass with both hands. It can. After they left, I stood in the hallway. The scent of rosemary and lemon still lingered in the air. The lights were low, dishes drying in the sink. No tension. No performance. Just peace. That night, I slept soundly, alone in my bed, and dreamed of nothing. Sometimes, the absence of dreams is the body's way of saying, you are safe now. By mid-November, the wildflowers Amanda and I planted had begun to break through the soil, tiny green shoots daring to rise in the chill. I crouched in the garden each morning with my tea, whispering encouragement like a prayer. Grow. It's safe now. And it was. Mostly. Until the past came knocking. Literally. It was a Thursday evening. The sky bruised purple with the early dark of autumn. I was sorting through old sketchbooks in the studio when I heard the knock, firm, familiar, too early for Amanda and too purposeful to be a neighbor. I opened the door with caution in my chest. It was David. He looked smaller. Not physically, he still stood tall, in that same long coat and boots that once made me think of old poems, but something in him had collapsed. His eyes had the color of regret, dark and aimless. Cass, he started, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't step back. I didn't invite him in. I just waited. He looked down at the welcome mat. Still the same one he picked out on our first anniversary, though now, the letters had faded like the promises he broke. I don't want to fight, he said. I don't know who else to talk to. My fingers tightened around the edge of the door. You're not here to talk, I said, quietly. You're here to be forgiven. His head lifted, startled. I don't expect you to. But you're hoping, I interrupted. Hoping that showing up makes you brave. That I'll see you and forget what silence cost me. He closed his eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. That's the problem, I replied. You never wanted to. You just let it happen. A silence stretched between us like a rope once tied to a shared life, now fraying. Your aunt wrote me, I said. Said you weren't doing well. He gave a tight nod. I'm staying with her. Lost the apartment. I waited. And when he didn't ask for anything more, money, help, a second chance, I felt something soften. Not for him. For myself. I hope you find healing, I said. But you'll do it without me. You lost that right when you let them move into me. Not just the house. He looked like he might cry. But I didn't. I closed the door gently, not with anger, but with finality. Behind it, I leaned against the wood and exhaled. That night, I didn't write a letter. I didn't burn anything. I just sat in my chair, wrapped in a blanket, tea cooling beside me, and whispered, "Well done." Because walking away is brave. But holding your boundary when they return? That's power. After David's visit, something inside me shifted, not with drama, but with quiet resolution. It was like the final piece of a lock falling into place. I didn't wake up radiant or reborn, but I noticed the way the world tilted slightly more in my favor. The fear that used to hum under my skin, fear of confrontation, of being wrong, of being too much, had gone still. I was no longer afraid of being alone, because I wasn't. I had me, and I was learning she was enough. Amanda noticed it too. One morning over coffee at the gallery, she cocked her head and said, "You're different." I smiled. Lighter. No. Rooted. She was right. I wasn't floating above my life anymore, observing from a distance. I was in it. Present. Choosing. Owning every moment. At the gallery, I began sketching again during lunch breaks, bold strokes, unforgiving lines. I didn't paint for beauty. I painted for truth. One piece in particular kept returning to me, a woman standing on a crumbling staircase, looking down, not with fear, but with clarity. She wasn't lost. She was leaving, eyes fixed on the horizon. I called it Descent to Freedom. Amanda insisted we frame it for the winter showcase. "It's raw," she said. "People need to see this." When we hung it on the wall, something unexpected happened. A woman visiting from out of town stood in front of it for nearly 15 minutes. She didn't speak, just stared. I approached her gently. "Hi there, can I answer any questions about the piece?" She turned, eyes shimmering. "I don't need you to," she said. I felt it. I just left a marriage like that. We hugged like old friends who didn't need backstory. Just mutual recognition. That was when I knew the truth about healing. It isn't always about forgetting the pain. Sometimes, it's about creating something from it so others don't feel alone. That evening, I lit a candle in the windowsill. Not for remembrance. For illumination. A way to say to the world, I am still here. Still standing. And now I shine. The snow came early that year. Soft at first, then steady, a white hush draped over the world like a clean slate. I stood at the window with a mug of tea, watching the garden disappear beneath the falling silence. Funny how nature knows when it's time to rest. To bury things for a while so they can rise stronger later. I felt a kinship with the earth that morning. Later that week, I received a call from my cousin Elise. We hadn't spoken in years, not since a family wedding where David had publicly joked about my hobby of painting. "Hey, Cass," she said, her voice hesitant but warm. "I saw your piece in that gallery spread in New England Living. Is that really you?" "It is," I said, surprised. "That's my work." There was a pause. Then, "It's powerful." She didn't say more. Didn't have to. Because in that single word, I heard everything the past never gave me: validation without requirement, admiration without strings. That night, I took out one of Grandma Evie's old letters. She'd passed when I was in college, but her voice still lived in the folded corners of yellowing stationery. "You have a quiet strength, Cassandra. That's the most dangerous kind. They'll overlook it until it breaks the ground beneath them." I hadn't understood it then. Now I did. David, his parents, Paul, they had all misread my silence as submission. But it was watchfulness. And like all storms, when I finally arrived, it was too late for them to take shelter. Later, Amanda and I hosted a holiday gathering at the gallery, mulled wine, candlelight, local artists. The space buzzed with soft music and warm laughter. Somewhere between the second glass of wine and a bite of cinnamon cake, Amanda nudged me. "There's someone I want you to meet." She gestured toward a man by the window, tall, with soft eyes and the kind of posture that spoke of gentleness, not ego. "Name's Eli," she whispered. "He runs a youth arts nonprofit. Recently divorced. Quiet. Thoughtful." I raised an eyebrow. "You trying to play matchmaker now?" She grinned. "I'm just introducing two people who know the cost of rebuilding." Eli and I talked for 20 minutes. About nothing and everything. Not once did he ask about David. Not once did I feel the need to explain who I used to be. That night, I didn't write a letter to the past. I wrote a note to myself. "You are not broken. You are beginning." After the gallery party, life began to take on a new kind of rhythm, one that didn't revolve around damage control or preemptive peacekeeping. My days were shaped not by the needs of others, but by the sound of my own breath, the pace of my own steps. I kept seeing Eli. At first, it was just coffee, casual, unpressured. He spoke in the same way he moved, slowly, with intention. We didn't talk much about our pasts. Not because we were hiding, but because we were both too busy rediscovering who we were now. One afternoon, we walked through a local craft fair, and I caught him watching me as I studied a glass sculpture of a phoenix mid-flight. "What?" I asked, smiling. "You look settled," he said. "Like someone who made peace with the fire." It took my breath, because no one had ever said that about me before. They'd said resilient, strong, even patient. But never settled. Never whole. Later that week, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. The one I'd avoided for years. Not because I didn't like how I looked, but because it had become the place where I rehearsed being acceptable. I used to look into that mirror and ask silently, "Is this enough to keep him happy?" Now I asked something else. "Does this feel like you?" I wore a linen blouse I'd bought on a whim at a local shop, soft sea blue with delicate stitching down the sleeves. My hair, slightly tousled, framed my face naturally. No mascara. No expectation. Just me. And for the first time in years, the woman staring back didn't look tired. She looked returned. That night, I took a bath with lavender oil, lit a single candle, and read poetry aloud to myself. It wasn't indulgent. It was sacred. Before bed, I opened my journal and wrote. He once said I was too much. Too sensitive. Too quiet. Too reflective. But he was wrong. I wasn't too much. I was too true for someone who hadn't yet met himself. The next day, Amanda texted me a photo from her morning run. The wildflowers we planted in early fall were blooming through the snow. A stubborn kind of beauty. Just like me, I end December, the air in town grew crisp and ceremonial, like the whole world had taken a deep breath and was waiting to exhale. The holidays arrived, but they no longer wrapped themselves around me with the weight of obligation. This year, I chose what stayed and what didn't. I didn't send out cards. I didn't put up the old garland his mother gave me, the one she insisted was heirloom, though it reeked of control. Instead, I strung tiny white lights across the mantel and placed a single ornament on the tree, a glass heart, cracked through the center, fused back together with gold lacquer. I'd found it at a local artist's booth. She called the collection Fractures of Grace. And that's what the season became for me, fractured, but graced. Elise visited the week before Christmas. She brought cinnamon rolls and stories, both warm. "I heard through the grapevine," she said, sipping cider at my kitchen table, "that Paul's living with their cousin in Maine. Can't hold a job. Blames everyone." I blinked slowly. Sounds about right. And David's trying to start a consulting business. Word is, he can't keep clients. Something about trust issues. I didn't reply. I just stirred my tea. Elise studied me. "You're different." "I'm me," I said. That used to be too quiet for anyone to hear. She smiled, reached into her coat pocket, and handed me an envelope. Inside was a certificate, official, state-sealed. I read it twice before looking up. "My name," I whispered. "You said you were going to reclaim it," she said. "I just helped speed up the paperwork." "Merry Christmas, Cass." It was done. Officially, legally, spiritually. Cassandra Rose Lewis. No hyphen. No attachment to someone else's shadow. My name was my own again. That night, I opened the front door and let the cold air rush through the house. Not because I wanted the chill, but because I wanted to feel the boundary between what was and what is. I whispered my full name into the dark. And the wind carried it like a promise. After Christmas, the days fell into that quiet hush between years, when time seems to exhale, and we all wait for a sign that something new has truly begun. The house, now fully mine in name and in energy, felt like a sleeping animal slowly stretching awake. One morning, I opened the door to the room I'd ignored the longest. The one we used to call the nursery. It had been empty for years. Not just physically, but emotionally. We talked about children in the early days, made hopeful plans, even painted one wall a soft, dreaming gray. But then his family moved in. And the conversation shifted from someday to maybe when things settle. Things never did. I stood in the doorway, fingers trailing along the edge of the frame, remembering how I used to imagine lullabies echoing off the walls. Instead, there had been tension, silence, avoidance. Now it was time to rewrite that too. I emptied the room slowly piece by piece, donated the old crib, gave the rocking chair to a neighbor with twins, and peeled the paint from the walls with care. Underneath the gray, I found the original color, a warm almond cream, still intact in places. A reminder of beginnings. When Amanda stopped by and saw the transformation, she asked gently, "What will this room become?" I smiled. Mine. Not an office. Not a guest room. A sanctuary. I painted it a soft blush, neither childish nor romantic. Just gentle. Just mine. I added a small daybed, linen curtains, and a bookshelf full of poetry and healing. At the center of the room, I placed a framed photo. Not of a child. Not of a family. Of the garden. Taken just after the wildflowers bloomed through the frost. A symbol of unexpected beauty after long winters. That room became where I went when I needed to remember. Life doesn't always give us what we planned. Sometimes, it gives us something better. The sanctuary room became more than a retreat. It became a confession booth, a concert hall, a cocoon. I found myself drawn there in moments when the world pressed too close. Not to escape, but to return. One evening, wrapped in a shawl and holding a mug of chamomile, I sat on the daybed and did something I hadn't done in years. I sang. It wasn't planned. The room had such stillness, such gentle acoustics, and something inside me just opened. The melody was soft, wordless, just sound and breath and memory. It floated into the quiet like smoke, curling along the bookshelves and through the linen curtains. And for the first time, I heard myself clearly. Not the girl trying to please. Not the wife trying to earn her place. Just me. And my voice was lovely. Not polished. Not powerful. But true. I cried, not from sadness, but from reunion. Because for so long, I had spoken only to soothe others. Smiled to calm the storm. Softened my edges to make room for someone else's discomfort. But now? Now I sang because the house was mine. The next day, I bought a used keyboard from a local thrift store and set it up by the window. My fingers were stiff, the notes rusty, but they remembered. Music, like truth, waits patiently beneath the dust. As winter deepened, I filled the room with sounds. Chords, humming, laughter, mine and Amanda's, and eventually Eli's. Yes, Eli. He had become a steady presence. Still quiet. Still gentle. But not absent. He never tried to fill the silence, only to witness it. One evening, he stood in the doorway of the sanctuary room and listened as I played. He didn't clap. He didn't comment. He just said, "That's a good sound, Cass. It sounds like home." I didn't need grand declarations. That was enough. That night, I wrote one last letter in my journal. To the voice I buried. I missed you. I'm sorry it took so long. But I'm here now. And I promise I'll never silence you again. By January's end, The world outside had gone full hush. Snow blanketed every rooftop, and the town slowed down, wrapped in scarves and a kind of collective quiet. And I, after a lifetime of motion designed to keep the peace, learned how to be still. Stillness is not stagnation. It's presence. It's a kind of holy pause. One afternoon, I lay on the floor of the sanctuary room, sun pooling around me like a blessing. I wasn't reading, painting, or journaling. I was simply being. And that, I realized, was the hardest thing to learn after a lifetime of surviving, how to just exist without apologizing. In the stillness, old wounds rose gently, not to hurt, but to be held. I remembered being 12, asking my mother what it meant to be a good girl, and her replying, "Someone who doesn't cause trouble." I remembered sitting in the car outside David's therapy sessions, waiting while he processed, and I remained uninvited to the conversation. I remembered each time I'd said, "It's fine," when it wasn't, because I feared being called dramatic. And I said to each memory, like a chant, "You were not the problem. You were the mirror." And they looked away because they couldn't face themselves. The house seemed to listen. Sometimes I think homes are like bodies. They hold trauma, memory, noise. But they also hold healing if you let them. This one was finally exhaling after years of being held too tightly. Amanda came by that weekend with cocoa and new watercolor paper. "You've been quieter lately," she said, glancing around. "I'm learning the difference between silence and peace." She nodded. "Big difference." We painted side by side for hours, saying little. Just two women who had survived, choosing color over bitterness. I painted a single candle flame on an endless dark canvas. Not flickering. Steady. When I showed Amanda, she said softly, "That's you." I smiled. "Yeah, it is." February came like a hush of breath on a window pane, soft and hesitant, as though even winter was beginning to second-guess its permanence. The snow still blanketed the edges of the garden, but the sun lingered a little longer now, touching the treetops, warming the air in degrees too subtle for anyone in a rush to notice. But I noticed. Every morning, I walked barefoot into the kitchen, grounding myself against the chill of tile and the comfort of routine. There was something sacred in the simplicity of these mornings, no schedule to please anyone, no rush to tidy the space before it was judged. Just me, the kettle, and the slow unfolding of the day. I no longer flinched when the doorbell rang. I no longer whispered apologies to no one for taking up space. I was, in every sense, returning. One Sunday afternoon, Eli brought over a small wooden box. "I made something for you," he said, a little sheepishly, as if bracing for rejection. Inside was a hand-carved journal cover, dark mahogany, smoothed at the edges and engraved in delicate script. "For the woman who returned." I touched the letters with reverent fingers. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "You don't have to use it," he said. "I just wanted you to have something no one else's hands have touched." The gift undid me. Not because it was perfect, but because it was intentional. Every choice, every gesture, was rooted in seeing me not just the survivor, but the artist, the woman, the person. Later, as I wrote my first entry in the new journal, I paused before the pen touched paper. And then I wrote, "This is no longer a story of escape. This is a story of arrival." I went for a walk the next morning, past the old coffee shop, down the street where David once kissed my cheek too quickly, distracted by a text. Everything looked the same. And yet, I walked through it all like a ghost turned flesh again, present, alive. When I returned, a single crocus had bloomed by the garden's edge. A small thing. But the first proof that the cold doesn't last forever. March arrived not with fanfare, but with the quiet dignity of thaw. The days still held a bite, but the earth had begun to loosen its grip, releasing scents of damp soil and possibility. I found myself spending more time in the garden, knees pressed to the earth, hands in the dirt, reacquainting myself with patience. The crocuses multiplied. Then came snowdrops, shy and white and defiant. Nature, it seemed, believed in me. Amanda called it the miracle of mundane things, this slow, unnoticed blooming. One afternoon, while clearing away old branches, I uncovered a cornerstone I'd forgotten existed. A marker I had once placed to commemorate the start of a life I thought I would build with David. The initials carved into it were barely legible, but still there. I sat with it for a long time, brushing moss from its face. Then I stood, fetched a small hammer and chisel from the shed, and added a line beneath the initials. She grew beyond. I didn't remove the old mark. I just reframed it. That night I lay in bed, moonlight spilling over the floor like silk. The house creaked, as old homes do, but the sound no longer felt ominous. It felt intimate, familiar, like the structure was learning to exhale along with me. In the sanctuary room, I began a new painting, a long canvas filled edge to edge with wild, blooming things. No symmetry, no planned composition, just chaos and color and life. I titled it The Garden Remembers. When I showed it to Amanda, she touched the edge and whispered, "This is healing. You've turned grief into landscape." I thought about how many things I'd once tried to prune too early, feelings, dreams, even parts of myself I feared were too unruly to survive love. But love, I now understood, isn't meant to tame us. It's meant to witness the wild. The day I finished the painting, I dug a new path through the backyard, lined with stones Amanda and I collected from the riverbank. Each one placed by hand. No one else's voice directing the shape. No one else choosing the destination. It led to the garden's edge, where the wildflowers had taken hold once more.